So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 19 Washington Square North, which is the home and intellectual center of NYU Abu Dhabi here in New York. My name is Michael Peruganan. I'm a professor of biology here at New York, and for my sins, I'm the interim dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. But the reason I'm in front of you today is I used to be the academic director of 19 Washington Square North, and so it was when I was asked to introduce today's speaker, I was happy to have it to do it. Um, Over the course of the academic year, 19 is the host to many exciting public events, such as public lectures, conferences, symposia. It's really a place where members of the NYU Abu Dhabi community who are here in New York, as well as the NYU New York community, can get together and interact with each other. It serves as a home, for example, for NYU Abu Dhabi students and faculty who are in New York at any one time, but it's also a place, a meeting place, as I said, for the larger NYU community, indeed the general public, to come and learn more about the work that's done here at NYU and at other parts of the world. A key partner of 19 Washington Square North, and a key component of NYU 19 is the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, which is ably led by its Director of Research and Academic Programs, Sharon Hakakian Bergman, who, with her staff, organizes many of the events here in 19. And today I'm very happy to see all of you at this public lecture by somebody I've known very well, Professor J. Van Bavel from the Psychology Department of Arts and Science here at NYU. Jay is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU, is also an affiliate of the Stern School of Business and Management and Organizations, and also a professor, and I have to find out what this is about, professor at the Norwegian School of Economics and director of the Center for Conflict and Cooperation. I love Norway, so that's going to be interesting how you're able to do that. He's also an associate editor of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Nexus. Jay studies how collective concerns, group identities, moral values, and political beliefs shape the mind, brain, and behavior. His work addresses issues of group identity, social motivation, intergroup conflict and polarization, cooperation, beliefs and misinformation, moral judgment and decision-making, social media, and public health. So as you can see, it's a very wide range of work that Jay engages in. He has published prolifically in the scientific literature and co-authored the book, The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony, the winner of the APA William James Book Award. And I believe downstairs later on, you have an opportunity to get a copy of the book. His work has also been cited in the U.S. Supreme Court and the Senate, and is consulted with the White House, the United Nations, the European Union, and the World Health Organization. Aside from all of this, Jay is also an active science communicator with over 100,000 social media followers. He writes the Power of Us newsletter and is written for the New York Times, the BBC, the Atlantic, Scientific American, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, Time, and the Washington Post. He has received several awards, including the Young Investigator Award for distinguished contributions in social neuroscience from the Society for Social Neuroscience, the Young Scholars Award for outstanding achievements in social and personality psychology from the Foundation for Personality and Social Psychology, the Janet T. Spence Award for transformative early career contributions from the Association for Psychological Science, and the F. McQuiggan Early Career Investigator Prize from the Alfred Psychological Foundation, as well as many others. Again, it's a pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon, early evening for this event. Let us welcome to the podium Professor J. Van Bavel.
Thanks to everyone for coming and attending the talk. I have a link there if you are an academic and you want to download my papers, or even if you're not an academic and you enjoy reading academic papers. And if you're generally interested in these topics, but you don't want to read boring scientific papers, the book is written for a broad audience. So it's something that I think anybody hopefully could pick up and read and enjoy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the stories that I talk about in the book and some of the studies, but also, since it was written a few years ago, some of the new research coming out of my lab. So first, I guess, I hope you saw the image in the back. And if you know anything about sports and sports history, that is Jesse Owens, one of the most famous athletes in American history, winning the gold medal at the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936. The Berlin Olympic Games are probably the most hostile place in human history, certainly for an African-American athlete. You can see everybody saluting to Adolf Hitler in the stands, except Jesse Owens. But he dominated the game. So this was seen as a rebuke of Nazi Germany and white supremacy. That's all about identity. But today I want to talk about a story that starts with his shoes. So these are the legendary shoes that Jesse Owens wore when he won multiple gold medals at the Olympic Games. And it turns out that they were created by a pair of brothers who were cobblers in Germany. And they came from a small town in southern Germany called Herzogenaurach. And there's a legendary blow up between the brothers during the war when there's lots of stories behind it, but the big story that has stuck is that they were being bombed by Allied planes, and one brother and his family were in a bunker hiding, and the other brother comes running and said, the bastards are back again. And apparently that offended the brother who thought it was about him and his family, and led to a lifelong feud that divided the town. And the town had a river running through the middle of it. It became known as the town of bent necks, because as people would walk around the town, they would stare at what your shoes were. And if you were wearing the wrong shoes, you were not allowed in certain bars or restaurants. You couldn't date certain people, because each of the brothers had started their own shoe manufacturing business on each side of the river. And so you had a fundamental loyalty based on shoes. And so it became an interesting example in my mind of how elementary forms of discrimination start, because this was in a small town where people shared the same religion, the same ethnicity. Most of them were employed in the exact same industry, and they lived meters apart and yet hated each other for many, many years on the basis of what shoes they wore. So this is the town now. It's apparently a beautiful, beautiful town. I also like this part of the story, that the two brothers, and by the way, this feud between the brothers and the conflict in the town lasted until they died. They insisted on being buried in opposite ends of the cemetery. So this was a very strong feud. And the companies that they started are Puma and Adidas, two of the world's biggest behemoths of sports shoe manufacturing. One brother was named Addy, and that's where Adidas came from. And the other brother was named Rudy, and that's where Puma comes from. And so this became an interesting example of how easy it is for people to embrace the notion of us versus them and discriminate against other people, even in the absence of any real fundamental differences, the things that we normally would assume drive conflict, discrimination, and intergroup violence. And so in social psychology, we have a way of understanding this. It started back in the 1970s, almost 50 years ago, and I consider it potentially the most important study in the history of social psychology, at least, where Henri Tajfeld, who's pictured here, basically decided to understand what the origins of prejudice were. And he was a Polish Jew, had to escape Poland when it was occupied by the Nazis. He ate his identification papers to avoid being imprisoned and killed. And he was stuck with what had happened to humanity and wanted to understand how it started. And so he thought, I'll be like a biologist and create a vacuum and add ingredients and find out what causes discrimination. And then I can figure out maybe how it starts and what can stop it. And so he first started with a control condition. He thought, I won't have anything different between the groups. There won't be differences in resources or a fight over power or differences in religion or belief systems or even stereotypes or contact between the groups. And then I'll add one ingredient after the other to find out what causes discrimination. And so people in his study, and I have run many studies like this in multiple countries, they will come in and you will flip a coin and put them in one team or the other. And what Tajfeld found, and many others have found, is the moment that they're part of a team, even if they don't even know anybody on their team, they start to identify with the team. They see them as an in-group, the other team as an out-group, and they will instantly start discriminating against the out-group. They will give more resources to their in-group. And so it was a shocking finding, because this was supposed to be the control condition. This was not supposed to be what caused discrimination. But it suggested that merely joining a group itself is sufficient to create discrimination via in-group favoritism, and because people identify with the group. And what I started studying when I was a PhD student at the University of Toronto was, maybe we can leverage this and find ways to use this to bring people together. Maybe we could find ways to flip a coin and put people in a group. Imagine dividing this room into two sides. And maybe that might be enough to get rid of some of the biases that people walk around the world with. And so in some of my earliest studies, we would flip a coin and just assign people to the Lions or the Tigers. They would never meet anybody on the other team. In this case, we had half of the members of each team were white and half were black. And what we found over and over again was this was enough to reduce racial bias. People would like members of their in-group regardless of their race. And we found this on explicit measures, implicit measures. We put people in an MRI scanner, and within minutes of being part of a group, we found almost no differences in how they were responding to race, which were previously robust findings that other scientists had found. Instead, they were responding based on group identity. They were responding differently to members of their in-group that was created just minutes ago. And so we have now followed this up in many, many studies, and we have found this overrides our most automatic evaluations. Within a few hundred milliseconds of seeing somebody, you were thinking about them in terms of their identity. Are they with me or against me? And it can override racial bias. We have found it shapes your memory for people. And this can override racial biases in memory. There's a classic finding that people have better memory for members of their own race, called the own race bias. Almost every ethnic group shows it. They basically leads to the feeling that they all look alike. If you've ever heard that saying, they all look alike about an ethnic group, that's a subjective experience you have when you have better memory for individuals in your own group. It turns out that can be erased the moment that members of different races are part of your group. You start to pay attention to them as individuals, and it gets rid of this racial bias that is really robust. It shapes where we attend, who we look to. It shapes how we imbue other people with mental capacities, which is core to empathy and humanization. We have an easier time seeing them as having a mind and feelings if they're part of our group than another group. And so this was one of our early papers led by a student in my lab, Jenny Shao. It led us to think that our groups fundamentally color the way that we see the world. And we filter it through like a lens, as if we're wearing different color of sunglasses. It shades how you see the world. Now, I was studying that when I moved to the United States in 2006, and I was did my postdoc at Ohio State University, and it was in the midst of the presidential election. I became all the presidential candidates came through Columbus, Ohio, because it was the core swing state in that election. And so we'd see presidents and vice presidents coming through every week or two. And I started to pay attention to American politics for the first time and noticed the intense animosity between Democrats and Republicans. I'm obviously not the first person to notice it. There's lots of evidence that there's been increasing animosity and polarization over the last few decades. And it struck me that this has a similar dynamics to the work I was doing on groups in the lab. And I teamed up with several political scientists and sociologists. And one of the things when we looked at the data, we noticed that first of all, there's increasing polarization in the US, but it's not due to an increase in liking your in-group or in-group favoritism. On a feeling thermometer from 0 to 100, people like their in-group at on average, about 75 out of 100. And that's been stable for the last 40 years. What's happened is people now dislike the out-group a lot. And that now is stronger than their like and their feelings of positivity towards their own group. And so you can see now in the last few years, people really now see the out-group as evil, as fundamentally different from them. And you see this for Democrats and Republicans in their self-reports. And this is important because it means that you will vote for a leader that you think is corrupt or bad or incompetent simply to keep the other party out of power. And this is where it becomes a fundamental problem. You will not cooperate with somebody, even if you agree on a policy that would be in both your interests and the interests of the electorate and your country, because you don't want to be seen cooperating with them. In fact, one of the studies we cited in our book was people, if you look in Congress, there was a study tracking how much they move and who they talk to, and they are talking to each other less and walking close to each other less over time. Physically, they're not moving too close to somebody from a different party over time. So you see this in all kinds of behaviors people don't even realize are being measured. And then I've been studying how this affects us psychologically and neurally. So one of the things that I became interested in this is how this guides our identities, guide our beliefs. So it guides our attitudes and our memory and our attention. I've shown you that. How do our politics guide, say, our beliefs and whether something is true or false? And to me, this is fundamental as I saw the growing spread of misinformation, conspiracy theories. And we developed a theory in my lab that we have lots of goals. One of our goals is to be accurate. If you're in this room on a university campus watching a scientific talk, you probably really value accuracy. But when our identity is at stake, sometimes it is the people in our group or our leaders are telling us something that's not true, but we want to believe it fundamentally because it helps us belong in a group. It gives us status if our group wins and our group is right and the other group is wrong. And so we look for evidence that confirms our identities. And so we've been studying how this leads to belief in misinformation. And then what we noticed is a big case where this played out was during the early stages of the pandemic. So in this case, as of January, almost exactly is it 6 years ago now? Wow. 6 years ago, in January of 2020, what you saw already was very different statements from the Republican leader, Donald Trump, downplaying the risk of COVID. And Joe Biden wrote an op-ed in the US News. He was not even yet the nominee for the Democrats, saying this is going to be a disaster. And so in poll after poll after poll, even before there were really any deaths in the US, in every single state, you saw that Democrats were more worried about the pandemic than Republicans. And you might think, oh, maybe Democrats are paying more attention to science and risk. But another study found that when Ebola came into the United States, Republicans were more worried than it, because at that time, Obama was the president. And so our distrust in our leaders to take care of risks can lead us to disbelieve the severity of real risks. In this case, we found that it predicted how people moved around the country. We had data from 15 million people moving around the country from their cell phones. And we could find that in Republican-leaning counties, they were not distancing. And this was in the early stage of the pandemic. And that predicted infections and mortality in those counties over time. And so this was something that was fundamental. And then it led to differences in vaccine rates. And in my lab, we have found that it also leads to how people believe fake news. And so here are some examples of fake news. You're probably very familiar with it. One of the interesting things here is you see that fake news about, this was from 2016, fake news about Hillary Clinton and Republican was created by the same outlets. So some of them are just profiting after because people click on this and share it. And so that generates a profit for places like Empire News. So they will share fake news about both parties if it gives them money and clicks. And we found that when you share identical fake news, we ran many studies on this, Democrats and Republicans are both equally likely to believe news when that belief affirms their partisan identity. So they believe negative news about the outgroup and positive news about the in-group. And that we found was pretty equal actually across both parties. However, we found a difference in who's willing to share it. Republicans were actually much more likely to share it on social media than Democrats. And we think that's because there's differences in norms about what's acceptable to share. But this reminded me of a very famous poster, some of you who are old enough to remember, in X-Files. Mulder had this poster on his wall, "I want to believe." This desire to believe things that may not be true is something that many humans do possess. And in the world of psychology, there's a very famous book written on this, where a bunch of social psychologists infiltrated a doomsday cult and were in the room when the clock struck midnight and the aliens were supposed to come pick them up. And they watched what happens, and people clung to their beliefs even after they were clearly false, because no alien ship came and no flood came that had been predicted by the doomsday cult. And the book traces many, many instances of this over history. And so people are willing to cling to all kinds of false beliefs, even when it's contradicted to their own face. And that book argued that they're especially likely to do it when members of their group are committed to the belief. It's really hard to cling to belief when no one around you clings to it. But if members of your community cling to it, and disbelieving it makes you an outsider and gets you kicked out of your group, and you lose a sense of belonging, then that's a strong motivation to continue to cling to that belief. And as I said, now we have a world where this is happening on social media. This was from a very famous paper published in Science magazine a few years ago. They found that fake news spreads faster than true news, and that's thanks to people, not bots. So we're doing this. If you actually dug into the paper like I did, what I found was that the two biggest predictors of the spread of false news, things that have been fact-checked to be false, was if it was in the domain of politics, in other words, connected to people's political identities, and if it triggered an emotion. And what the study found was tweets containing falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted than truthful tweets. And so I've been trying to understand this now. How is our identity operating in the age of social media? And I love this video. This is a Sugriva, a chimpanzee. Chimpanzees are our closest evolutionary ancestor. They share over 99% of the same DNA as us. In the wild, they only can use 22 documented tools. They can use like a stick and poke it into a termite hill and eat the termites off it, very primitive tools. But you can see here, they have absolute fluidity using modern smartphones and social media. Look at this Sugriva scroll through social media, and you'll notice what she looks at. She looks at friends and foes. She looks at the snake, which is a core potential predator of chimps, and then goes to look at a picture of her with her friends, her keepers getting a piggyback ride. So she's triggered by these emotions just like we are. And this reminded me of one of my favorite quotes by evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, who wrote, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and it is terrifically dangerous." And I've been thinking about this, how this operates in the world of social media. So when I made this slide, it was 5 billion. Now it's over 5.5 billion people are on social media. Average user scrolls through 300 feet of content every day. So if you have a smartphone, it's 6 inches. That means you're scrolling through 600 swipes of your newsfeed each day. That's the height of the Statue of Liberty. If you want to go see what that looks like, go down to Battery Park. So we're all operating this attention economy. So companies are profiting from keeping us online. They have algorithms that amplify content that keeps us hooked. And we're operating there. If I want to share a paper or a study on social media, I have to find a way to make it interesting so it pops out to people so they don't miss it. Because otherwise I'll get drowned out by everybody else shouting. And to put it in context, how much time the average user is spending on social media, if you look over the course of a full life of a person, will accumulate to 5.7 years of their life. They're spending about 2.5 hours a day, added up over 80 years. Young people are spending much more time, sometimes 4 or 5 hours. So this is probably only going to increase for younger generations. I'll just show of hands here. How many people checked your phone when you first woke up this morning? By the way, I did. Look around the room. It's about half the people. How many people checked it last thing before you fell asleep last night? Okay, so about a third of this room is checking it other than when they're unconscious. That's when you get a break. Otherwise, we're really glued to it. People are checking their phones an average of over 100 times a day, just grabbing it and looking for all kinds of reasons. And so we've been studying what drives engagement in the attention economy. And we're in a world where one of the things that drives it, as I said, in the spread of, for example, misinformation, is things that trigger an emotion. So we're now testing and finding over and over again that things that trigger strong emotions, specifically things that trigger emotions connected to our identities, like outrage, are the things that people see, it pops up in their visual attention, we found, and that predicts if they share it online. And then, of course, it cascades out to hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And so we've created a model called the MAD model, because outrage is a big trigger. But really, it's about things that are motivating, that motivate us to pay attention and are amplified by the platform are the things that get spread. And so I'll give you an example. Many of you might know of this. This was a massive challenge to our institutions, the Me Too movement, a hashtag that started on social media, instantly spread around the world, even though it started in the US with a few celebrities, and led to many people being fired from their jobs, institutions having new policies. And that the ripples are still happening. I know in many institutions I belong to, in the world of psychology, we're still dealing with these cases. There was a social psychologist who studies intergroup relations at Oxford in Bloomberg News last week with a huge scandal because they didn't deal with it institutionally. So this is still resonating through our society and changing things, hopefully for much better. A study looked at people who walked around the world and they gave them a diary and they pinged them several times a day to ask what they were paying attention to, what was triggering their emotions. And they found that things where you're learning about morality is fundamentally online. You can see people learn about morality and immorality way more online than in person or on print TV and radio combined. So we think the media matters a lot. Well, in the domain of morality, it's the online universe that's driving it. And in particular, notice that people are learning about immorality way more than morality. That's like the classic saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Those are the messages that are spreading and getting our attention. And then the next graph shows moral outrage. If you ask people what emotion they're experiencing most of the time, if they're experiencing moral outrage, it's usually driven by content they saw online. It's not happening as much from things in person or things in all the mainstream media outlets combined. And this was a paper published in 2017. We're a decade later. I would guess that this discrepancy is even higher because many more people are spending much more time online. And so we've been studying this, as I said, in my lab. We started by looking at 3 issues: gun control, same-sex marriage, and climate change. We analyzed 560,000 social media posts. And what we found over and over and over again for all 3 topics, and pretty much every topic we've since studied, is when people use a moral emotional word like outrage, they get a 20% bump in how many people reshare their message. So if you use 5 words that trigger moral emotions in a message, you're doubling the virality of your message online. And just using pure moral words that don't have the emotional content are having no effect. And we recently published a paper, this was from last month, analyzing almost 5 million posts on multiple social media platforms across, I think, 27 topics in many labs around the world. And we find the same effect over and over again. Okay, so now you know how to go viral. But when we analyzed who was sharing it, we found something really interesting. This might be two sides of a sword with two sides. So your message is going viral, but when you're using that language of moral emotions, it's only engaging people who share your ideology and are part of your team. So Democrats and liberals are only engaging with other Democrats and liberals when they see messages like that. And on the right wing, and conservatives and Republicans are only engaging with conservatives and Republicans. So moral emotions are linked to polarization. They create these echo chambers in our conversations. And we have found this in many studies in my lab. It makes, if you use that language, people see you as hyper-partisan. So it's like a bat signal out into the world about what team you're on. And if they don't agree with you, they suddenly see you as far more closed-minded than if you talked about the exact same issue in a slightly more neutral way without the moral emotions attached. Then that becomes more persuasive. They will engage with you and talk with you. They see you as more open-minded. But if you use this language, they see you as kind of closed-minded and fixed in your belief and hyper-partisan, and they won't listen to you. They only engage with people like themselves when that language is being used. So we found the words from this dictionary we created to study this, and then we looked at the ones that were most polarizing. We identified all the words that were most polarizing, and we created an online dictionary of polarizing words. And then we started to analyze it all different contexts to see who was using it and was it increasing and so forth. And one of the things we found is that this turns out to be the language that is increasingly being used by foreign influence campaigns. So we got data from a Russian troll farm, and you can see over time in the last decade, they've been using this polarizing language more and more and more. And so what they're fundamentally trying to do, we think, is just create conflict and division and fundamentally threaten democracy. Americans aren't actually using it more, although we didn't have a huge segment of time and data for them. Then we analyzed a bunch of data. We wanted to look at also emojis. The emoji of anger we thought was on Facebook is the closest thing we could think of to this feeling of moral outrage. And when we analyzed nearly 3 million posts on Facebook and Twitter and the emojis, we found that when people are sharing negative news about an outgroup, the most powerful emotion it triggered was outrage, this anger emoji. And there was a leaked report from, it was investigative journalists who found this from the Facebook papers, that Facebook's algorithm was intentionally amplifying posts on its platform that use that emoji, as opposed to just the like or thumbs up emoji. So at the time, that meant if someone shared something and it triggered outrage, it would appear in many more people's feeds. And so this is being amplified by the design of these algorithms. And they might not even be aware of it. They just know that that drives engagement and people are online longer and they make more money, right? So I'm not arguing they're intentionally causing conflict, but they're certainly incentivizing it through their algorithm. And we found that each term referring to a political outgroup, which were almost entirely negative, increased the odds of a social media post being shared by 67%. So this was even stronger than moral emotional words. Just simply saying the outgroup is awful, sharing content about them that's bad, turns out to be the most powerful thing we found for making your message spread. And we found this we studied every member of Congress and Senate in this country. We analyzed all their posts for a year. We analyzed major news media outlets in this study. And we find they're all getting this benefit. So these are going really viral when you're talking about those types of groups. And so I was thinking, this online world is really incentivizing it. And then on January 6th, 2020, I turned on the TV and actually probably social media and saw that all these kind of avatars from the social media world came to life and tried to block the certification of the US election. So this was a fundamental threat, in my opinion, to US democracy. And the New York Times was doing a story on it. And they contacted us and they're like, how do we study the language that political leaders are using and that might predict if they're anti-democratic, if they're trying to block the votes from being counted? And then they got a bunch of data from emails and social media posts of every member of Congress. And they used our polarization dictionary. This was on the front page of the New York Times. It's not a scientific paper, so no peer review here for those of you who care. We tried to get the data to publish it, and they would not give it to us. But they published their analysis. So this is from the Times. What you see is that polarizing rhetoric is increasing over time. At first, it increased higher among Democrats after Trump was elected. And then around 2020, something fundamentally changed. And it was really being used, this divisive language, by Republicans. And they started to look at which Republican members of Congress and leaders were using it. And they found that there's actually two groups of Republicans. You can't actually treat them all the same here in this rhetoric. What they found is that the Republicans who were using this divisive language the most were the people who refused to certify the 2020 election. So these people were not supporting our democratic process. They were trying to interfere with it. The Republicans who supported the democratic process to certify the election were not using this language. So again, you see the same thing among our Russian troll army as you hear about this subset of political leaders. So I thought this is going to be a pretty dark message I'm going to share with you. So I thought maybe I'll end with some optimistic news about how identity can be maybe used in a positive way if we harness it to bring people together. So because I and many others have been growingly concerned about this and threats to democracy and partisan animosity and all these things. So there was a group out of Stanford University who did a challenge. They called it the Strengthening Democracy Challenge. And they invited any research team or any think tank or nonprofit from around the world to submit to them an intervention, a short message that they could give to Americans to see if it could reduce partisan animosity, so this hatred, not their political beliefs about policies, but just their hatred towards the outgroup, and also increase their support for democratic procedures and reduce support for partisan violence. And they got 252 submissions from all over the world. And then they had a panel of experts, mostly political scientists, who read all the proposals and picked what they thought were the best 25. And then they tested them in 32,000 Americans, a totally representative sample. And they wanted to see what works. Let's test all our theories and pit them against one another. And then not only let's see what works in the short term, but let's follow up people a couple weeks later to see what sticks. And so we submitted an intervention based on reminding people they have a common identity, a shared set of norms and values, a historical set of institutions that are unique to America, that have been endorsed and supported by American leaders for a long time. And it was based on a chapter in my book, I think chapter 6. So we thought, let's try this. I was quite anxious to see if it would actually work because someone else ran the study, not us. And we got the data. So they sent us the data. This was read by Jan Volkel and Rob Willer at Stanford. And what they found is a number of the interventions worked. However, a number of interventions actually backfired. They actually made partisan animosity not as good, if anything, a little bit worse than just a control condition. But I will say that ours was the third best out of this entire study. The common identity one you see third from the top. So it had a really strong effect at reducing partisan animosity. It lasted for up to 2 weeks, and it also increased support for democracy and democratic procedures and institutions. The two that were better than us, I'll tell you, they beat us out. The best one was actually a beer commercial. They just submitted straight up this Heineken beer commercial, if you've seen it. And it shows people building a bar together, and they don't know why they're doing it. And then at the end, it shows a video of their political beliefs, which are very different. And then they put a beer on the bar, and they say, do you want to talk about it? And people are like, yeah, let's talk. Because they had built something and done something and shared a goal together first and built, even in a short time, a relationship, became a foundation for being willing to talk about differences. Just that commercial, which was very slickly produced, was the single most effective message. So kudos to the advertising executives. They do know something. But basically what it's showing is a classic finding from psychology, which is called contact theory. When people have positive contact with outgroups, and they're doing something together, working towards a common goal, and they're at similar levels of power, and one group isn't dominating the other, that's one of the best tools we have for reducing animosity across all kinds of groups throughout the last 70 years. So that basically, I think that beer commercial is harnessing a psychological process called as intergroup contact, positive intergroup contact. The second one was about media trust. It was revealing that the media is often misrepresenting your group. And if people feel that understood that they are being misrepresented in the media, that actually makes them feel a little bit better. And more actually a fair amount better about the other party. And there's kind of a sense of, okay, we're being misrepresented, you're being misrepresented, and that's not good. Okay, so there was ours. So I'm hoping this comes full circle from my very first studies I did on my dissertation, that that identities can cut both ways, right? They can be things that divide us. A flip of a coin can cause discrimination. A pair of shoes can be grounds for not dating or marrying or serving somebody at a restaurant. But it can also, if it's done in the right way, reminding people they share an identity, whatever it is, whether it's we share an identity as members of a community, as members of a country, as members of a university. Those are things that if you do them well and make people feel that it's genuine, are things that can make people more open-minded to engaging with other people who are different than them. So the long point here, and this is really the thrust of the book, is that we contain multitudes of identities. We are not just one thing. Each of us walking around the world has many identities. I'm here speaking to you as an NYU professor, an author. When I'm in my classroom, I think of myself as a teacher. When I go home in about an hour, I'm going to think of myself as a father and make sure my kids get dinner. Maybe I'll call my mom later and then be thinking of myself as a son and slip back into that identity. And so we have a lot of identities we slide in and out of as we're in different situations throughout the day. And those identities fundamentally shape our cognition, our beliefs, our attention, our feelings, and our behavior. And as I've shown you, social identity can lead us astray, can lead to conflict and discrimination. That's one of the most, I think, fundamental aspects, unfortunately, about human nature. But it can also be something that connects us to others. We can find a common identity. In fact, this is what you do when you meet a stranger, or you're at a conference or an event. You're trying to find what you have in common. Common friend, a common hobby, a common background, a common place you're from. And if you can find that, it can create solidarity, and not just in that moment, but there's lots of evidence that can create solidarity to take on bigger challenges. One of the studies I was going to show you is about, I didn't think I'd had time, but about how this can be used to remind people, for example, they have common identities and shared norms as global citizens to address even bigger issues like climate change. So this is not just an issue of politics or, race or groups that I create in the lab, but it's fundamentally about everything we have to face, I think, as humans. And that's why when Michael said I study all these topics, it's because I study how this plays out in everything from our public health to our beliefs to things like climate change. So that it's not the whole answer, but I think it's part of the answer. So if you're interested in learning more, here's our website for the Center for Conflict and Cooperation. I have a QR code if you want to check it out. We have a newsletter you can follow if you want to get updates every week. We post a new study or describe something happening in the news through the lens of science. And I also have copies of my book downstairs. Hannah has them if you want to buy a copy and read more about this. But I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.